The Thing on the Doorstep and Other Weird Stories by H.P. Lovecraft. The Enigmatic Asenath. Asenath Waite, a woman shrouded in enigma, hailed from the decaying seaport of Innsmouth. Her lineage was as ancient, secretive as the town itself, with rumors of her family's involvement in occult practices that dated back centuries. Her arrival in Arkham was met with whispers and wary glances, for her reputation as a keeper of forbidden knowledge preceded her. Edward Derby, a scholar of the arcane, was captivated by Asenath's profound understanding of mystical arts. Their fateful meeting set him on a path of no return. Asenath's influence over Edward was subtle at first. His dreams became vivid gateways to other worlds, and his thoughts echoed with incantations and visions of eldritch symbols. Is this real, or merely a delusion? Edward pondered aloud, his voice trembling as he traced the unfamiliar sigils that appeared on his study's walls. Asenath's response was a sly smile. Reality is but a thin veil, Edward, one that we are about to tear through. The transformation within Edward became more pronounced. His once stuttering voice now carried an assertive tone that commanded attention. His eyes, once filled with curiosity, now held a piercing gaze that seemed to look through people. Friends and colleagues began to distance themselves, unnerved by his newfound demeanor. "Edward, you speak as if you're reciting an ancient script," his colleague, Professor Armitage, observed with concern. "And your eyes, they are not your own." Edward's laugh was hollow, a sound that seemed foreign even to him. "Perhaps I am merely embracing my true potential," he replied, but doubt gnawed at his mind. The streets of Arkham, once familiar and comforting, now twisted into a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. The air was thick with the scent of the sea and something else, something ancient and waiting. Innsmouth's decrepit harbor called to him, its dilapidated buildings and murky waters reflecting the darkness that was slowly consuming his soul. "I must resist," Edward whispered to himself as he stood at the water's edge, the taste of salt and decay on his lips. "I must seek help before I am lost." But with each step he took towards salvation, the tendrils of Asenath's sorcery tightened their grip, and Edward Derby feared that he was already ensnared in a web from which there was no escape. The shadow over Edward. Edward Derby sat in the dimly lit study, his hands trembling as he leafed through the ancient tome that Asenath had brought from her ancestral home in Innsmouth. The pages were filled with strange symbols and incantations that Edward felt compelled to understand, yet feared deeply. "Why must you read that book every night, Edward?" asked Daniel Upton, his closest friend who had come to visit him. "I must, Daniel. There are things I need to know," Edward replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel leaned in, concern etched on his face. "Who's Ephraim, Edward?" "Ephraim Way, Asenath's father. He's using me, Daniel. I can feel him taking over," Edward confessed, a look of terror crossing his features. "But how? How is he doing this to you?" Daniel pressed, desperate to understand. Edward's voice dropped to a fearful whisper. "The esoteric ceremonies and the clandestine journeys to the ancient ruins described in this book, they're all part of it. Asenath, she's an account." Daniel stood up, determination setting in. "We need to get you away from here, away from her. You need help, Edward." Edward shook his head, a tear rolling down his cheek. "It's too late for me, Daniel. I'm not sure how much longer I'll be myself." As the night wore on, Edward shared more of his fears and the strange occurrences that had become his reality. The midnight calls were more than mere sounds. They were whispers in an unknown tongue, chilling to the bone, and sometimes a faint chanting could be heard, as if a congregation of shadows was performing a ritual just beyond the veil of reality. Daniel left Edward's house that night with a heavy heart, knowing that his friend was caught in a web of supernatural horror that he could not begin to unravel. The shadow over Edward was growing darker, and time was running out to save him from the sinister force that threatened to consume his very soul. In the midst of this darkness, a new figure emerged, a mysterious librarian named Marian Ashcroft, who had studied the occult and claimed to have knowledge that could counteract the influence of Ephraim Waite. Daniel knew that she might be their last hope to save Edward from the abyss that was claiming him. Desperate measures. Edward Derby sat in the dimly lit room of his old Victorian house, the shadows casting long fingers across the walls. The air was thick with the scent of old books and the faintest hint of the sea, a reminder of Asenath's heritage. "Edward, you must listen to me," the narrator, his old friend from Miskatonic University, pleaded. "You've been distant lately, lost in your own world. What's happening to you?" "It's Asenath," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's using me to bring back her father, Ephraim, to continue his work." The narrator leaned in, concern etched on his face. "But why? Why would she do this to you?" Edward shuddered, pulling his coat tighter around him. "Ephraim was a powerful sorcerer, connected to the Deep Ones, to Innsmouth. We need to get you help, Edward. Medical help, legal advice, anything to free you from this," the narrator urged. Edward shook his head. "My lawyer and banker, they're all under her spell." "You're not alone," the narrator corrected firmly. "I'm here, and I'll stand by you. We'll find a way to break this curse." Edward looked up, hope flickering in his eyes for a moment. "No, it's too late for me. I'm becoming something not human." "Then we fight, Edward. We fight this together," the narrator said, gripping Edward's shoulder. Edward nodded. "All right, let's do this. But we must be cautious. Asenath is a force of nature, a descendant of creatures from the depths of the sea and beyond." Together they began to plot their next move, unaware of the eyes watching them from the shadows. Return to Crown and Shield. Edward stood before the imposing gates of the Crown and Shield house. The ironwork twisted into shapes that seemed to move in the corner of his eye, and for a moment he hesitated. The house seemed to call him back with an invisible force. He made his way to the library, where the shadows whispered secrets. Running his fingers over the spines of the books, each a tome of forbidden knowledge that Asenath had brought into their home, he felt a chill. "I had to come back," Edward said to himself. "There are things I need to understand, to confront." Daniel Upton, his friend who had been watching over him, stepped out of the shadows, his face etched with concern. "But at what cost, Edward? You're not yourself when you're here." Edward's gaze drifted to a book on the table, its pages open to a diagram of strange symbols. "I know, but it's the only way to break free from her, from all of this." Daniel moved closer, placing a hand on Edward's shoulder. "We can leave now, together." But Edward shook his head. "No, I must face this alone." He turned to the window where the last light of day cast long shadows across the floor. "I have to end it, Daniel, for all of us." With a determined step, Edward walked towards the heart of the house, where the true nature of the Crown and Shield legacy awaited him. Ready to sever the connection that bound him to a fate worse than death, Edward Derby stepped into the darkness, prepared to confront the horrors that lay beyond. Transformation. Edward's hands trembled slightly as he navigated the car through the streets of Arkham, the engine's low growl a stark contrast to the silence that hung between him and Daniel Upton. Daniel watched Edward closely, his concern growing with each passing moment. "Edward, are you sure you're all right?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with worry. Edward glanced at Daniel, his smirk a hollow echo of his usual demeanor. "I'm better than all right," he replied, his tone laced with an eerie certainty. Asenath's influence has been enlightening. Daniel's frown deepened as he pondered the change in his friend. The Edward he knew was hesitant and cautious, not this confident enigma who spoke of Asenath as if she had imparted some arcane wisdom. As the Crown and Shield house loomed ahead, Edward's thoughts were a tumultuous storm. Oh, she's changed me, but to what end? Oh, he wondered. What awaits us in that house of secrets? Oh, God. Edward, the house. It's changed you, Daniel said, breaking the silence. I know, Edward replied, his grip on the wheel betraying his inner turmoil. But I must return. It's as if a force beyond my control compels me. The car slowed to a halt outside the Crown and Shield house, the finality of their arrival hanging in the air. We've arrived, Edward stated, his voice a strange blend of his own and something other. Daniel's pulse quickened as he stepped out of the car, following Edward into the house where the air was heavy with the promise of hidden truths. The Edward Derby he once knew had vanished, leaving behind a man who walked the line between the known and the unknowable. What lay ahead in the Crown and Shield house's shadowy embrace was a mystery that filled Daniel with both dread and awe. The inescapable truth. The night was unusually quiet as I approached the Crown and Shield house. The air felt heavy, as if charged with an unseen energy. I hesitated at the door, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the knob. Inside, the dimly lit hallway stretched before me, leading to the library where I knew I would find Edward, or whatever was left of him. Edward? I called out softly, my voice barely a whisper. There was no answer, only the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. As I entered the library, I saw him. Edward sat in his favorite armchair, his back to me, his head bowed. The room was filled with strange artifacts, books with titles and languages I couldn't recognize, and objects that seemed to twist the light around them into impossible shapes. Edward, we need to talk, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned slowly, and I gasped. His eyes, once lively and piercing, now reflected a void, devoid of the warmth I knew. There is no Edward, he replied, in a voice that was both his and not his. Only the will of the Ancient Ones. I took a step back, my mind racing. This was the moment of truth, the inescapable reality of the cosmic horrors that had taken hold of my friend. What have you done with Edward? I demanded, trying to hide the fear in my voice. He is here, the entity that was once Edward said, gesturing to itself. And yet, he is not. We are beyond your petty concerns of individuality. I remembered the rumors, the sobbing voices from the house, the strange behavior of Asenath, and the unnatural events that had led us here. It was all connected, all part of a larger, darker truth that I had been too afraid to see. You can't stay like this, I said, my resolve hardening. You're endangering everyone. Edward, you have to fight it. The entity laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. There is no fight to be had. The change is complete. The connection is eternal. But I knew what I had to do. The safety of our reality, the very fabric of our world, depended on it. With a heavy heart, I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers closing around the engraved silver amulet I had brought with me, the one piece that could disrupt the arcane energies binding it. I'm sorry, Edward, I whispered, my heart heavy with the decision I was about to make. Was it? A grim decision. Dan paced his study, the urgency of the situation igniting a resolve within him. He had witnessed his friend's torment, and now the time for action had come. Without a second thought, Dan made his way to the Crown and Shield house, the very place that seemed to be the source of Edward's affliction. The house loomed before him, its presence as foreboding as the secrets it kept. Dan's determination did not waver as he knocked on the door, the sound cutting through the stillness of the night. Edward greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, Dan, come in," he said, his voice betraying none of the turmoil that Dan knew lay beneath. Once inside, Dan wasted no time. "Edward, this has to stop," he declared. "We have a plan, and I need you to trust me." A flicker of recognition passed over Edward's face, and he nodded, a silent plea for help. Dan, with a steady hand, produced an ancient tome of spells, a remnant of their youthful adventures, and together, they began the incantation. The shadows danced wildly as they chanted, the atmosphere thick with the weight of their words. A scream shattered the silence, a sound that seemed to come from another world, marking the climax of their struggle. And then, as quickly as it had begun, calm returned. Edward collapsed, and Dan was at his side in an instant. "Edward?" he called out, concern etched in his voice. Edward's eyes fluttered open, clear and unmistakably his own. "Dan?" he murmured. "Is it over?" With a nod and a smile, Dan confirmed, "It's over. You're safe now." In the quiet aftermath, they sat together, the ordeal behind them. Dan knew that the bond they shared had triumphed over the darkness, a testament to the enduring power of friendship. Severing the connection. The night was still and cold as the narrator, a close friend of Edward Darby, made his way through the dimly lit corridors of the sanitarium. Clutching the letter Edward had sent, the words within confirmed the grim reality. Edward had succumbed to the sinister entity. Approaching the door, the narrator heard Edward's voice, now laced with malice. "Edward, it's me," he called out, fear gripping his heart. Silence, then a reply. "He's just a shell now." The narrator, armed with a silver amulet, a relic inscribed with arcane symbols, a memento from a previous brush with the supernatural, knew it was time to act. He had planned this moment, knowing the amulet's power to protect his own soul was limited. With resolve, he opened the door. Confronted by the entity wearing Edward's guise, the narrator stood firm. "I'm not here to stop it," he declared, drawing his concealed gun. "I'm here to end it." The shot echoed, and the entity fell. The narrator, standing over Edward's body, felt the weight of his decision. "I'm sorry, my friend," he whispered. "May you find peace now." With the entity vanquished, the narrator reflected on the necessity of his grim decision, aware that the battle against the lurking horrors was far from over.